Good morning. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Samuel the Chronicles study. We're in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and down at verse 17. There's my email if you want to get a hold of me or contact me for any reason at all whatsoever. I want to remind you that we just finished covering 1 Samuel, and 1 Samuel talked about, of course, the first king. It told us about Samuel, who was the prophet that God raised up, and then he anointed Saul to be the first king. And then Saul became jealous because God anointed David king. And then in 1 Samuel, we saw David basically outliving King Saul after Saul tried to kill him. And so Saul dies, and we find ourselves in 2 Samuel. Now, as we take a look at 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel deals with the second king of Israel, David, and it deals with mainly his life. Most of it does. So you have the reign of David, his triumph, and his reign over Israel, his sin, his punishment, and then his troubles. And then you have some stuff at the end of 2 Samuel. And so we're in this section right in here. We're talking about David ruling over Judah, because you remember that Saul was ruling over all of Israel. And then when he died, Judah made David king over them. And now we're going to see that the kingdom is going to start to be given over to David. And that's what we have here beginning at chapter 5, when David reigns over all of this. And this is what's called the United Kingdom period. This period, and also the period when Solomon's going to rule. After Solomon, we have the divided kingdom. And remember that Chronicles also talks a little bit about this information, but it highlights here, if you see down here under the chart for Chronicles, King's David. And so this is King David, and this is his part of his history, but it really doesn't start matching up with 2 Samuel until a couple of chapters in. And then when it does, that's when we'll start to pick it up and look at it. But just wanted to point that out to you and remind you of that. Now, as we get ready to take a look here at 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 17, let me remind you what happened over here in chapter 2. In chapter 2, you had David, who what was the anointed king. David was anointed king over Judah. Remember, he'd been anointed king by God quite a couple of years before he actually became king. And then when Saul fell and died, then Judah appointed him king. And in Israel, they appointed Ishbosheth. And Ishbosheth was made king. And so you have these two rival kings or rulers ruling over Israel. And so they had a battle, this battle at Gibeon. And Abner's men, who is the commander of Ishbosheth's army, the king of Israel, they were defeated. And Joab, who was the commander of David's army, defeated Abner. But when I say that, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden all of the people came over to David. It just simply means that David's reign was established in Judah, and Ishbosheth couldn't do anything about it because Abner wasn't strong enough. And so there was a number of years when there was two rulers during this time. And also there's probably a period of time when Abner was basically ruling the country, you might say, by military rule, until he appointed Ishbosheth ruler. And when he appointed Ishbosheth ruler, then Ishbosheth was the king, but basically he was just a puppet king, you might say. But as you get into chapter 3 then, and we looked at chapter 3, we then see Abner is going to be joining David. But as we do that, notice that it says in chapter 3, now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. And so then he goes through and it lists for us David's family that he had in Hebron while he was there ruling. And then we notice that there was this dispute that happened between Ishbosheth and between Abner. And that dispute was that Ishbosheth was basically charging Abner with trying to take over the throne by accusing him of sleeping with his father's concubine. Now, there's a little dispute about this. Some people say that he actually did it, and Ishbosheth confronted him with it. But I don't think he actually did it. I don't think he was trying to gain the kingdom for himself. or gain power. He was already a powerful individual, and apparently he didn't want to rule because he appointed Ishbosheth king. Not only that, but when Ishbosheth then charged him with that accusation, then Abner, rather than trying to take over the kingdom for himself, told Ishbosheth that he was going to give the kingdom to David. And so that's where we have them now. And so Abner sent messengers to David here in verse 12 to his place and made a covenant with him in order to bring Israel over. And David said that he would, but in order for David to meet with Abner, Abner had to bring him Michal. Remember that Michal was his wife that he had purchased by 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Remember when Saul was trying to kill David? One of the ways he tried to kill him was by saying that he could be his son-in-law and marry Michal, and if only he would give him 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And of course, he was hoping that David would be killed, but he wasn't. And so rather than, when David gave him the dowry, which by the way, David gave him 200 foreskins, instead of giving Michal to him, Saul gave Michal to her husband, what's his name here? Peltiel, her husband Peltiel. And so David said that he wouldn't meet with Abner unless he returned Michal to him. And so when he did, Peltiel was, trodden along behind until basically Abner said, "You better go back because, this is David's wife." And he actually bought her and purchased her. And so he returned home. Now, verse 17 is where we're at. And so verse 17 says in 2 Samuel 3, verse 17, "Now Abner had consulted with the elders of Israel, saying, in time past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then, do it. For the Lord has spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies." Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. And in addition, Abner went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron all that seemed good to Israel and to the whole house of Benjamin. Then Abner and 20 men with him came to David at Hebron, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And Abner said to David, "Let me arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that they may be king over all that your soul desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Now, we want to talk about this for just a minute, because we're going to notice some other things that happen as a result of this. So verse 17 says, now Abner had consulted with the elders of Israel, saying, in times past you were asking for David to be king over you. Now, if you notice this, Abner had promised to David that he would give the kingdom to David, or that he would give Israel to David, that he would help Israel basically come over to David's side, because Ishbosheth was still alive. And so Abner goes and talks with the elders of Israel. And notice that he says, saying, in times past, you were seeking for David to be king over you. So apparently, Israel, at one time or another, kind of wanted David to be king over them. And maybe that's when Abner had Ishbosheth made king instead, because there was a time when Israel didn't have a king after Saul died. And before they made Ishbosheth king, probably around, if I remember right, about around 5 years. And so it could be that during that time, Israel had wanted David to be their king, but instead Abner puts in Ishbosheth to be king because he's the descendant of Saul. Now, he reminds them of that when he meets with the elders of Israel, and says in verse 18, now then do it, for the Lord has spoken to David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies. So Abner and the elders basically decide to allow David to be their king. And that's what it says here. For the Lord had spoken of David, saying that by the hand of my servant David, he would deliver Israel. And so they realized that there was a divine announcement or pronouncement that David was going to be Lord over Israel, and that he was going to be the one who defeats their enemies. and so therefore, they really should make David their king. And so basically that's what went on. That's kind of the discussion that happened, so that Abner then could bring the kingdom over to David. Now, verse 19 says, Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. And in addition, Abner went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron all that seemed good to Israel and to the whole house of Benjamin. And so it says that basically Abner went, he talked with Benjamin, which is the tribe where Saul came from. And so he talked to Benjamin, and even Benjamin had decided that they should allow David to be king, because Ishbosheth was a very weak king. He was nothing more than really a figurehead. He was a puppet. And so in verse 20, it says, then Abner and 20 men with him came to David at Hebron, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And so basically, after they had that discussion with the elders, and after they had that discussion with Benjamin, and they were all kind of in agreement, then David came with a representative of people to David at Hebron in order to tell David that the kingdom was going to be brought over to him. And so when that happened, it says, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Now, this idea of David eating with Abner is the idea of David making a covenant with them. So David made a covenant with them, an agreement. And the covenants they made in those days were covenants that determined peace, or treaties that you might say. And so David was making a covenant with Abner, and basically was going to allow Abner to bring over Israel and the army of Israel on David's side, so that he could then rule over all of Israel, not just Judah. And so David made a feast, and that shows David's attitude towards Abner. He didn't just invite him over and speak of political things, but he ate with him, and eating with them was always something that entailed or that included the idea of being at peace with somebody and of having a covenant with somebody. That's the reason why in the Bible they had the peace offerings. The peace offerings were different than the burnt offerings. The burnt offerings were burnt up totally because they represented somebody who was out of a relationship with God and needed to get into a relationship with God. But the peace offerings are those offerings that are offered because we have peace, we sustain a relationship with God, and therefore that's a shared meal. And so that's the idea of eating with him. And that's also true in the New Testament, where in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, talking about brothers who are liars and fornicators and homosexuals, he said that the church is not even to eat with them. That's the idea. So eating with somebody is the idea of fellowship and giving them your right hand of fellowship, your acknowledgement that they're okay, and supporting them. And so it was more than just them sitting down and having a meal together. This represented David's agreement with them and David's covenant with them that he would basically take care of them. Now, beginning of verse 21, let's do some reading. Abner said to David, let me arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may be king over all that your soul desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. And behold, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them, but Abner was not with David in Hebron. And he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the army that was with him arrived, they told Joab, saying, Abner, the son of Ner, came to the king, and he has sent him away, and he has gone in peace. Then Joab came to the king and said, what have you done? Behold, Abner came to you. Why then have you sent him away, and he is already gone? You know Abner, the son of Ner, that he came to deceive you and to learn of your going out and coming in and to find out all that you are doing. And so basically what happens is, as David makes this covenant with Abner, and Abner leaves, that in the meantime, David's army, some of his army, and his general Joab is coming back from a raid. It says in verse 21, Abner, the son of David, let me arise and go. And so he sent him away in peace. But verse 22 says, and behold, the servant of David and the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he sent him away, and he had gone in peace. So when Joab returned, he found out that David had entertained Abner, and that apparently he made a covenant with him, and he sent him away in peace. And verse 23 says, and when Joab and all the army that was with him had arrived, they told Joab, saying, Abner, the son of Ner, came to the king, and he has sent him away, and he has gone in peace. So the army reports to Abner what happened and what they see, and that is that Joab's army reports to Joab what David had done in making a feast with Abner and then sending him away in peace. Now, you have to remember that there was also, as we read back, when they were having that war with Israel and Judah, you remember it was Abner who killed Joab's brother. Remember the individual who, I believe his name was Ishbosheth, let me see, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. It's right over here. Right here. Asahel, Asahel was one of Joab's brothers. And you remember that Asahel was the one whom Abner killed because Asahel wouldn't leave Abner alone, but kept pursuing him. And so Abner thrust him through with a blunt end of his spear, and he died. And so that was in battle, remember that. But that's going to be important as we get into this section, because I believe what we have here is we have Joab trying to figure out a way to get back at Abner for what he did, even though it was a time of war. And so it says in verse 23 down here, when Joab and all the army that was with him arrived, they told Joab, saying, Abner, the son of Ner, came to the king, and he has sent him away, and he has gone in peace. And then Joab came to the king and said, what have you done? Behold, Abner came to you. Why then have you sent him away, and he is already gone? In other words, what Joab's saying is, Abner is our enemy, and Abner's been our enemy, and he came to you, and you let him go away without, restraining him, or without executing him, or without anything. But remember, David had made a covenant with him. David had eaten with him, and so Joab was really upset because he was. I'm sure part of the thing is he was hoping to have Abner killed in response to Abner killing Asahel. And so he was really upset. Now, verse 25 says, you know Abner, the son of Ner, that he came to deceive you and to learn of your going out and coming in and to find out all that you are doing. And so Joab basically tells David that you can't trust Abner, that Abner's not somebody you can trust, that he's an individual who just came in basically to spy out what you have. And now he's going to go and gather all Israel, and they're going to come out, and they're going to fight against you now that he knows your forces. Now, remember, however, that they already had a fight a few years earlier, and David's men had defeated Abner and his men. And in the meantime, Abner had not been able to gain much successes with the skirmishes and the battles that he had with David during those years that there were those two rulers. And so I don't really think that's the motive that's under consideration, but that's the facade, you might say, that Joab uses in an effort to justify what he's going to do to Abner. Joab wants to kill Abner in revenge for what Abner has done to his brother. Now, the thing to remember is this, is in a time of battle when men are fighting, it's never considered war. It's never considered murder. There's no place in the scriptures where they take one group of men who are fighting with other soldiers. I'm talking about fighting with other soldiers, not necessarily fighting against a civilian and just, killing civilians. That would be a different thing. But men who are engaged in battle, military people who are fighting against each other. There's no place in Scripture where God ever takes the military people and says, you have murdered people, and so therefore you need to be executed as a murderer. There's no place in Scripture where it says that. And so therefore there's no justification for Joab to want to kill Abner other than simply revenge, because Abner did not kill his name keeps slipping me. Let me read it again over here. Asahel. Okay. Asahel. And so as Abner killed Asahel, it wasn't that Abner did it out of hatred. Matter of fact, Abner told Asahel, to leave, that he didn't want to hurt him. But it was during battle. And not only that, but Asahel is pursuing Abner. So there's nothing that Abner did that would justify any kind of court or anybody to say that Abner needed to die because of what he did on the battlefield to a soldier who was out to kill him. And so therefore it was, as far as Abner is concerned, he's just defending himself on the battlefield, and Asahel died as a result. Now, let's see what Joab does, though. And notice that as we read what Joab does, he doesn't consult with David, okay? And notice what it says, verse 26. When Joab came out from David, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah, but David did not know it. So when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the middle of the gate to speak with him privately. And there he struck him in his belly so that he died on account of the blood of Asahel, his brother. Afterwards, when David heard it, he said, I and my kingdom are innocent before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. May it fall on the head of Joab and on all his father's house. And may there not fail from the house of Joab one who has a discharge, or who is a leper, or who takes hold of a distaff, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had put his brother Asahel to death in the battle of Gibeon. And so notice what happens here. Joab is just looking for a reason to kill Abner. And here's the thing, when you're looking for a reason to do something bad, you'll use any reason you can, because you're not really looking for justification. You're just trying to make yourself feel better for what it is that you're about to do that is wrong. And so it points out in verse 26, when Joab came out from David, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah, but David did not know it. So what you have is Joab goes out after meeting with David, and apparently David had told Joab that, he made an agreement with Abner turning the kingdom over to him. And so that's why he let him go. And so he now doesn't have any worry about Abner. And so Joab comes out and sends messengers, his own messengers, to Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah. But David did not know it. And so I don't think that Abner was going out to rally the troops against David, because once he had seen David's forces, if that's what he came out to do, why return when Joab asked him to come back? And so basically he would have no reason to come back, even if David had asked Abner to come back, and Abner's purpose was to go out and rally the troops against David. Abner would have no reason to come back. He'd just bring the troops and fight against David if that was his intention. But I don't believe it was. I believe Abner was a more respectable person than Joab was. Joab was a very wicked and violent person, and it doesn't take much to see that. Joab enjoyed, you might say, bloodshed and war and those kinds of things. And there are people that are born in this world like that. It kind of reminds me of the story of Patton. Patton was a general of the United States who seemed like his whole life was based on war and fighting war and strategies, and he was very good at it. But yet, after the war ends, what does somebody like that do? And so, anyway, what you have Joab, and so Joab comes out, and he sends messengers to Abner, and so Abner comes back and returns to him at Hebron. So he comes back to Hebron, and Joab took him aside into the middle of the gate to speak with him privately. So if you can think of Joab coming in, and there's this gate as they're coming in, and there's kind of a center way in it, someplace that's not real obvious or open, you might say, and right there where it was more of a private matter, there he struck him in the belly so that he died on account of the blood of Asahel, his brother. Now, the reason that Joab killed him was because of the fact that Abner had killed his brother Asahel, but it was in a time of war, and that's what it says down here even. It even affirms that it was during a time of war, and so there's no reason to kill somebody after the war is over if they happen to be the individual who killed your brother or your family member. You don't have a right to go out and kill them and claim that you're doing it as a matter of judgment because they murdered your relative. But in verse 30 it says, the very last verse says, Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. So it was done during a time of war, during a time of people fighting. And so therefore there was no justification for Joab to do this. This also explains why later on, after David was about ready to die, and he was charging Solomon with things he wanted to do, or things he needed to do to make the kingdom right, you might say, or to make sure the kingdom was just, was he needed to kill Joab. And so Solomon was the one who ended up killing Joab because of the killing of Abner. And so we know that was not during a time of war. David had made peace with Abner, and so Joab had no right to kill him. It could also be that Joab was jealous of Abner because Abner was going to bring over quite a sizable number of troops compared to the troops that Joab had. And if David happened to just allow Abner to be leader over the troops he was bringing and Joab over the troops that David already had, then Abner's troops would be a whole lot bigger than Joab's troops. And so there'd be that sense of rivalry that's going on there. And so I'm kind of persuaded that's also one of the reasons why he wanted Abner dead. But his excuse was that you couldn't trust Abner. Well, it as you can see, the person you couldn't trust was Joab, because Joab blatantly killed him without any kind of trial, if in fact, he was worthy of death. So it says, so when Abner returned, Joab took him aside into the middle gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the belly, but he died on account of the blood of Asahel, his brother. Afterwards, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are innocent before the Lord forever for the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. So David says, I didn't know anything about it. Nobody in my kingdom knew anything about it except for Abner and those people except for Joab and those people who happened to be with him at the moment that they killed Abner. And it says afterwards, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are innocent before the Lord forever, the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. May it fall on the head of Joab and on all his father's house. And may there not fail from the house of Joab one who has a discharge, or who is a leper, or who takes hold of a distaff, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. And so one of the things that it points out here is that David says that he's innocent. David is in a real predicament here, because what it might seem like happened is David calls Abner over under the pretense of a white flag, of a truce, and then he ends up killing him. And so it looks like you can't trust David, and that David lied as Abner came and was trying to bring Israel's army under David's rule, and then David goes out and kills him because they look at what Joab did and they see it as something David would do. And so David wanted to distance himself from this circumstance and from this event, and so therefore he puts a curse on the house of Joab and says that the blood of Abner is on the house of Joab and on all his father's house. Now, if this was a righteous sentence and a righteous judgment that Joab had carried out, David would have never said this. And people would have understood that Joab had a right to kill him had Abner actually murdered his brother Asahel. But it wasn't murder, and it wasn't in a time of peace. But Joab did kill Abner at a time of peace when there was no war. And so therefore that would be considered murder. So it's interesting that many times what we accuse other people of doing is the very thing that we end up doing ourselves. And yet we justify ourselves, but we can't see any justification for the other because that's the way we are. Now it says, may it fall on the head of Joab and on all his father's household, and may there not fail from the house of Joab one who has a discharge or who is a leper or who takes hold of a distaff or who falls by the sword or who lacks bread. Now, there has been in recent times what they refer to as generational curses. And some people believe in these generational curses. And basically what a generational curse is that it's like this right here, where it says that David is cursing Joab. And so as he curses Joab and he curses his father's house. And he says, may there not fail from the house of Joab one who has a discharge or is a leper or who takes hold of the distaff or who falls by the sword or who lacks bread. And in other words, David is cursing Joab's house, and the descendants of Joab are going to be cursed with these ailments and this leprosy and cripples who have to hold a cane. That's the idea of a distaff. They have to hold a cane, and they're going to die from violence, and they're not going to have much to eat. And so some people believe in these generational curses, and so they think that if things are happening in their house or in their family, maybe they have maybe people in their family have a discharge, or it's kind of like in families you might have cancer that runs in a family, which is the reason why if you have cancer or if your parents have had cancer, they want to screen you early because it's more likely that you might have it. So a lot of there is this movement today where they have this generational curses that they say, and they basically have individuals who say they can come and remove that generational curse from you so that you and your family can be healed. The problem with that is this isn't exactly what this is talking about when it speaks about your father's house. Basically, what he's saying here to Joab is that God is going to punish Joab and Joab's father's house for the crimes that they've committed, and God is going to do that by having them have a discharge or leprosy or those kind of things. Remember that under the curses that God had told them under the curses in Deuteronomy, that if they leave God, that they would receive the plagues and those kind of things that were on Israel. Remember, that were on Egypt. And God said that if Israel, for example, starts to worship idols, that God would bring upon them the plagues and those kinds of things. And that's what I believe is going on here. As long as Joab's house is behind Joab and they're supporting Joab, then God is going to bring curses on them, and they're going to have problems in their family. But I believe that it will end when people turn to the Lord and do what's right. And so that's what I think is going on here. I don't think what God says is that he's going to punish your children down the line because of something you did, because the Bible is very specific about the fact that God doesn't bring judgment on the son for the sin of the father. And I know that that's what Calvinism teaches. Calvinism teaches that all men are born in sin because we're receiving the punishment that's due Adam. And because we're Adam's children, we get the punishment that's due to Adam and the condition that's due to Adam. But yet Ezekiel chapter 18, the whole chapter deals with the fact that that's not the way God is. God doesn't punish one person for another man's crimes. That's not what's under consideration. And so that's not what I see going on here. But I do want you to understand that there is this generational curses that are going on. And there's even some people who specialize in ridding your house of generational curses. And of course, excuse me, of course, they basically do it for money. And so I'd suggest to you it's just simply a scam and a way of taking people's money, and it's not really in the scriptures. Now, verse 30. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, and that's the reason why it's on his father's house, because Joab didn't do it by himself, but Abishai, also his brother, killed Abner because he's put their brother to death, their brother Asahel to death in the battle of Gibeon. See, they knew that he died in battle, but yet they still killed him. And so they still killed him. And so therefore it was an unlawful judgment that was brought on them. But apparently David didn't feel that he could do anything about it personally at this time, other than show his disdain for the action and the activity that Joab did. Now, remember, Abner was the commander of the army of Israel. He was gaining power. He was going to bring all the army to David. And so now Joab kills Abner. And so it looks like David ambushed Abner. And so you can't trust David. So why in the world would you want to join forces with him if he kills your general under a flag of truce? And so David then is going to show again his attitude towards his enemy, because certainly Abner one time was his enemy before they made the covenant. But now I want you to notice again David's attitude towards his enemies. And I believe this is what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount when he says we're to love our enemies and we're to do good to them. And that's what you're going to notice here. So in 2 Samuel 3, verse 31, it says, Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, Tear your clothes and gird on sackcloth and lament before Abner. And King David walked behind the bier. Thus they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king chanted a lament for Abner and said, Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet put in fetters. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And all the people wept again over him. Then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was still day. But David vowed, saying, May God do so to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun goes down. Now all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, just as everything the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the will of the king to put Abner the son of Ner to death. Then the king said to his servants, Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too difficult for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil. And so here you have David's reaction as he finds out that Joab killed Abner and the manner in which he killed him. Now, verse 31. Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, Tear your clothes and gird on sackcloth and lament before Abner. And King David walked behind the bier. So in other words, they're burying Abner. And as they bury Abner, David's men and everybody that's with him is supposed to tear their clothes, which is a sign of mourning. and they're to tear their clothes. And Joab was to tear his clothes also as a sign of mourning. He had been commanded by David to tear his clothes, to indicate that he shouldn't have done this deed, even though it's already been done. Joab was commanded to mourn over the death of Abner as well. And so he says, tear your clothes and gird on sackcloth and lament before Abner. And King David walked behind the coffin. So as the coffin was going to be buried, David walked behind it. And verse 32 says, and thus they buried Abner in Hebron. Now, Hebron was David's city at that time. David's city was there. That was, his fortress. And so to be buried in the city of the king was an honor. And so this shows you the honor that David had for Abner, that he allowed Abner to be buried in Hebron. It says, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner. So David also was demonstratively mourning over Abner at the grave. It wasn't a fake, it wasn't fake crying, or he had real tears. And all the people wept, and everybody wept. So everybody was crying for Abner. And the king chanted a lament. Remember, David is a musician, so he makes a lament or a dirge, and it says for Abner, and said, should Abner die as a fool dies? Now, David then points out that Abner died in a very foolish way. Not that Abner did anything foolish, but the foolish way was that there was no reason for him to be killed. In other words, that he died in a very foolish manner. The person who killed him was very foolish in killing him. He points out that your hands were not bound, nor your feet put in fetters. In other words, he hadn't been tried. He hadn't been accused of anything. And he hadn't been put in a position where he was going to receive judicial execution. It says, when one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And so David says that Abner was the righteous one, and the one who killed him was the wicked one. And so basically what David is saying is that Joab was the wicked one for killing Abner. And it says, and all the people wept again over him. So they all wept over Abner again. It says, then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread. And the reason they did that was because he's fasting. He's fasting for Abner because of his respect and his love for Abner. And it says, then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was still day. But David vowed, saying, may God do so to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun goes down. Now all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, just as everything the king did pleased all the people. So the people, as this funeral was going on, and as the events were going on, the people realized that it wasn't David's intention for Abner to be killed. That it wasn't something that David wanted or that David ordered. David didn't order Joab to do this. And that's why it says in the next verse, so all the people and all Israel understood that that day, that it had not been the will of the king to put Abner, the son of Ner, to death. Then the king said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And so he says to his people that he considered Abner a prince and a great person. And remember that they had made this covenant together. And then verse 39 says, I am weak today, though anointed king. In other words, he says that because Abner died, it has weakened his power, you might say. And you might wonder, well, what does he mean by that? Well, what he means by that is that Abner's influence was so great that the lack of his influence would cause his army to be weaker and not maybe fight as skillfully or as tactfully as they should, because Abner's gone, and so therefore it weakened his power, you might say. He says, I am weak today, though anointed king. And he says, not only that, and these men these men, the sons of Zerai, are too difficult for me. In other words, he says that Zerai's boys are real difficult to deal with. That would be Joab and Asahel. I'm sorry, and Abishai. Joab and Abishai were difficult men to deal with. And, as I pointed out before, they seemed to like the idea of war and violence, and they really weren't concerned about doing so much what God says as much as they just enjoyed their job. And so he then points out in the last part of verse 39, and may the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil. And so he calls Joab an evildoer. And so it's really interesting that here in public, David is reprimanding his general, and yet his general is still going to be his general, because apparently David can't find anybody better than that. I guess it would kind of be like a general who gets a reprimand on his record, and everybody knows there's a reprimand on his record, but he still gets to be the general because there's nobody as good as him in the position or who can do it. And so that's what you have going on here. But David points out that they're very difficult men to deal with in this endeavor. Now, verse 4 or chapter 4. Remember that Abner's dead, but Ishbosheth is still alive. And as long as Ishbosheth is still alive, he's really the king over Israel. And until he relinquishes his throne, David isn't going to go out and try to forcibly get it or remove it, because just like when he did with Saul, David didn't go out and try to forcibly remove Saul, even when he had opportunities to kill him, because he was waiting for God and God's own timetable. And sometimes we need to remember that in our lives, that we want something to happen, and we know it's going to happen. We want it to happen now, and instead we need to wait for God and wait for God's timetable. And sometimes that might be difficult to see, but we need patience as we're dealing with the things in life as God is working out his will in our life. And so that's what you see here. So Ishbosheth is still in power. He's still the king, even though he might be a puppet king. But Abner, his general, is dead. Now let's see what happens. Chapter 4, verse 1. Now, when Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel was disturbed. Saul's son had two men who were commanders of bands. The name of the one was Banah, and the name of the other was Rechab, sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite of the sons of Benjamin. For Beeroth is also considered part of Benjamin. And the Beerothites fled to Gittim and have been aliens there until this day. Now, I want to stop there and just try to figure this little section out right here, because basically what this is telling you is that Ishbosheth is king, and Saul's sons heard that Abner had died, so he's their commander in Hebron. And so now they're like I pointed out, they're kind of wondering about David. Can they trust him? What's going on? And not only that, but since Ishbosheth was the puppet king, and Abner was really the one who was leading or ruling, you might say, when they heard Abner died, therefore they were very disturbed, and they lost courage, because it was like, well, who's going to lead us, and who's going to lead Israel if Abner's gone? Who's going to be in charge of the soldiers? Now, we then hear about these two sons of Saul. Saul's sons had two men who were commanders of bands. The name of the one was Banah, and the name of the other was Rechab, sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite. Now, these individuals apparently were sons of Benjamin. Now, that's where Saul came from and Saul's family came from. But apparently, this group of Benjaminites had been, either expelled or they themselves revolted against what was going on, and they had fled. And notice that it says, for Beeroth is also considered part of Benjamin, and the Beerothites fled to Gittaim and have been aliens there until this day. So apparently these men from this town that belonged to Benjamin, which means they should have been people following Saul, but for some reason they didn't want to follow Saul. And so they had basically pulled away and gone out and made their own little community, you might say. Well, two of these men is who we're talking about. Now, verse 4, let's do some reading. Now, Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. So the son of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab, and Baanah departed and came to the house of Ishbosheth in the heat of the day while he was taking his midday rest. They came to the middle of the house as if to get wheat, and they struck him in the belly, and Rechab and Baanah, his brother, escaped. Now, when they had come into the house, as he was laying on his bed in the bedroom, they struck him and killed him and beheaded him. And they took his head and traveled by way of the Arabah all night. Then they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, Behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Thus the Lord has given my lord, the king, vengeance this day on Saul and his descendants. Now, let's talk about these guys for just a minute. So Abner dies. These gentlemen who are alienated from Benjamin and basically from the house of Saul hear that Joab dies. So now they're going to take advantage of this. And since Ishbosheth is such a weak person, it says now, well, it first interjects for us the story of Mephibosheth. Here in verse 4, it says, Now Jonathan, Saul's son, remember that's the one that David had the covenant with. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. So when Saul and Jonathan had died, if you remember, when they died, then the nurse took the baby and ran, because generally what happens is when you have one dynasty that leaves and a new dynasty comes in, one of the things the new dynasty does is they go out and they kill all the descendants of the previous dynasty so that they have no bloodline or no right to the throne. But you remember that David had made a promise with Jonathan that when David was made king, he wouldn't hurt the house of Saul. He wouldn't do what's usually done and go out and kill them. But the nurse, of course, didn't know that. So when she heard that Saul and Jonathan were dead, she fled. And as she was hurrying, she fell. And when she fell, apparently she dropped the child or fell on the child, and he became lame. So maybe his hips were broken or his back was broken. But anyway, and his name was Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth is going to become an important character here in the story of David and in the life of David. But here's where he's introduced to us. Now, right after that, it says, So the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite and Rechab and Baanah departed and came to the house of Ishbosheth in the heat of the day while he was taking his midday rest. Now, you might say that it was during siesta time. In many places where it's hot during the noon hour, many countries actually take a couple of hours off and nobody works until the heat leaves, and then people go back to work a little bit later. And so during that time, there's not a lot of people that are out running around, or there's not a lot of people in the house because they're resting. And so it was during that time that these two guys come in, and they come into Ishbosheth's house, and they come into the middle of the house as if they were going to get some wheat. In other words, they're going to get some provisions because after all, he was the king. And many times the king would have provisions for people or have things to be taken, from one community to another. And it says, and they came to the middle of the house as if to get wheat, and they struck him in his belly. And Rechab and Baanah, his brothers, escaped, so they killed Ishbosheth. Now, verse 7. Now, when they came into the house, and here's going to tell you exactly how they did it. When they came into the house, as he was laying on his bed in his bedroom, they struck him and killed him and beheaded him. So they chopped off his head before they escaped. And they took his head and traveled by way of the Arabah all night. So they basically, decapitated him and took his head, and they were going to Hebron, and they traveled all night to get there. Now, verse 8 says, and then they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy who sought your life. Thus the Lord has given my lord, the king, vengeance this day on Saul and his descendants. And David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother's son of Rimmah, the Beerothite, and said to them, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, when one told me, saying, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house, on his bed? Shall I not now require his blood from your hand and destroy you from the earth? Then David commanded the young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hung them up beside the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron. And so Ishbosheth is still king. And so you might be wondering what's going to happen to him. Well, that's what Rechab and Baanah, his brothers, end up doing. It says basically that they come to the house of Ishbosheth while Ishbosheth is there. They come to his house while he's taking his nap, midday, taking his nap. And it says he was lying on his bed right here in verse 5. In the heat of the day, midday rest. Verse 6 says they came to the middle of the house as if they were going to get wheat. And then verse 7 says, and when they came in the house, he was laying on his bed, and so they killed him. Now, they took his head and they brought it to David. And no doubt they're thinking, well, David is going to really appreciate the fact that we've taken care of his problem. His problem is that, Ishbosheth is still king, and that's his problem. But what they failed to understand is that David made a covenant with Jonathan. And the covenant that he made with Jonathan was not to hurt Abner, not to hurt Saul's house, that he wasn't going to destroy all the descendants of Saul like most kings do when they take over a dynasty. And so it says in verse 9, and David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, sons of Rimmon and the Beerothite, and said, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, when one told me, saying, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag, which was the reward I gave to him for his news. And so basically David says, look, when they told me Saul was dead, and he considered himself an enemy to me, I didn't consider himself my enemy. And somebody came in and they told me that they killed Saul because they thought Saul was my enemy, and David, and they thought David would be pleased. He says he put him to death. Now, verse 11 says, how much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed? So these men were thinking they were doing something good for David by killing Ishbosheth. But instead, David says, you guys are wicked because you killed an innocent man. He says, shall I not now require his blood from your hand and destroy you from the earth? And so basically David said, because you killed a wicked man, then you are going to die, because he was a righteous man. It wasn't his fault he was made king, you might say. It wasn't his fault he was a descendant of Saul. But not only that, David had made a promise not to destroy the house of Saul. And yet these men think that by destroying the king, Ishbosheth, that David would be pleased with that. And again, this shows you David's attitude towards his enemies. David doesn't see these individuals as his personal enemies. That's not the way he viewed them. We might view them like that, but David does not. Verse 12. Then David commanded the young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hung them up beside the pool in Hebron. Now, why cut off their hands and their feet? Because their feet were what took them to do evil, and their hands were what they used in doing the evil. And so it was a sign that wicked hands and wicked feet were used to bring down a righteous person. He says, but they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron. So they took Ishbosheth's head, and rather than burning it or discarding it, they actually gave it a proper burial, and they put it with Abner in Hebron, again, in the city of David, no doubt with honors. And again, that shows you the attitude that David had toward his enemies. And so there is a good place for us to stop. And so we'll start chapter 5 next week. Pray the Lord blesses you and keeps you and helps you in everything that you do.